Leon Trotsky, again and once more again on the nature of the USSR. Psychoanalysis and Marxism. Certain comrades or former comrades, such as Bruno R., have forgotten the past discussions and decisions of the Fourth International, attempt to explain my personal estimate of the Soviet state psychoanalytically. Quote, since Trotsky participated in the Russian Revolution, it is difficult for him to lay aside the idea of the worker state inasmuch as Trotsky would have to renounce his whole life's cause, end quote, etc. I think that the old Freud, who was very perspicacious, would have cuffed the ears of psychoanalysts of this ilk a little. Naturally, I would never risk taking such action myself. Nevertheless, I dare assure my critics that subjectivity and sentimentality are not on my side, but on theirs. Moscow's conduct, which has passed all bounds of abjectness and cynicism, calls forth an easy revolt within every proletarian revolutionary. Revolt engenders need for rejection. When the forces for immediate action are absent, impatient revolutionaries are inclined to resort to artificial methods. Thus arises, for example, the tactic of individual terror. More frequently, resort is taken to strong expressions, to insults, and to imprecations. In the case which concerns us, certain comrades are manifestly inclined to seek compensation through, quote, terminological terror. However, even from this point of view, the mere fact of qualifying the bureaucracy as a class is worthless. If the Bonapartist riffraff is a class, this means that it is not an abortion but a viable child of history. If its marauding parasitism is, quote, exploitation, end quote, in the scientific sense of the term, this means that the bureaucracy possesses a historical future as the ruling class indispensable to the given system of economy. Here we have the end to which impatient revolt leads when it cuts itself loose from Marxist discipline! Exclamation point. When an emotional mechanic considers an automobile in which, let us say, gangsters have escaped from police pursuit over a bad road and finds the frame bent, the wheels out of line, and the motor partially damaged, he might quite justifiably say, quote, this is not an automobile, devil knows what it is, end quote. Such an estimate would lack any technical and scientific value, but it would express the legitimate reaction of the mechanic at the work of the gangsters. Let us suppose, however, that this same mechanic must recondition the object which he named, quote, devil knows what it is, end quote. In this case, he will start with the recognition that it is a damaged automobile before him. He will determine which parts are still good and which are beyond repair in order to decide how to begin work. The class-conscious worker will have a similar attitude toward the USSR. The class-conscious worker has full right to say that the gangsters of the bureaucracy have transformed the worker state into, quote, devil knows what it is. But when he passes from this explosive reaction to the solution of the political problem, he is forced to recognize that it is a damaged worker state before him, in which the motor of economy is damaged, but which still continues to rim and which can be completely reconditioned with the replacement of some pads. Of course, this is only an analogy. Nevertheless, it is worth reflecting over. Quote, a counter-revolutionary workers' state, end quote. Some voices cry out, quote, if we continue to recognize the USSR as a workers' state, we will have to establish a new category, the counter-revolutionary workers' state, end quote. This argument attempts to shock our imagination by opposing a good programmatic norm to a miserable, mean, even repugnant reality. But haven't we observed from day to day since 1923 how the Soviet state has played a more and more counter-revolutionary role in the international arena? Have we forgotten the experience of the Chinese Revolution, of the 1926 general strike in England, and finally the very fresh experience of the Spanish Revolution? There are two completely counter-revolutionary workers' internationals. These critics have apparently forgotten this, quote, category. The trade unions of France, Great Britain, the United States, and other countries support completely the counter-revolutionary politics of their bourgeoisie. This does not prevent us from labeling those unions trade unions, from supporting those trade unions' progressive steps, and from defending those trade unions against the bourgeoisie. Why is it impossible to employ the same method with the counter-revolutionary workers' state? In the last analysis, a workers' state is a trade union which has conquered power. The difference in attitude in these two cases is explainable by the simple fact that the trade unions have a long history, and we have become accustomed to considering trade unions as realities and not simply as, quote, categories in our program. But as regards the workers' state, there is being evinced an inability to learn to approach the workers' state as a real historical fact which has not subordinated itself to our program. Imperialism? Question mark. Can the present expansion of the Kremlin be termed imperialism? First of all, we must establish what social content is included in this term. History has shown the, quote, imperialism of the Roman state based on slave labor, the imperialism of feudal land ownership, the imperialism of commercial and industrial capital, the imperialism of the Tsarist monarchy, etc. The driving force behind the Moscow bureaucracy is indubitably the tendency to expand its power, its prestige, its revenues. This is the element of, quote, imperialism in the richest sense of the word, which was a property in the past of all monarchies, oligarchies, ruling castes, medieval estates, and classes. However, in contemporary literature, at least Marxist literature, imperialism is understood to mean the expansionist policy of financial capital, which is a very sharply defined economic content. To employ the term, quote, imperialism for the foreign policy of the Kremlin without elucidating exactly what imperialism signifies, what imperialism for the foreign policy of the Kremlin signifies, means simply to identify the policy of the Bonapartist bureaucracy with the policy of monopolistic capitalism on the basis that both one and the other utilize military force for expansion. Such an identification, capable of sowing only confusion, is much more proper to petty bourgeois Democrats than to Marxists. Continuation of the policy of Tsarist imperialism. The Kremlin participates in a new division of Poland. The Kremlin lays hands upon the Baltic states. The Kremlin orients toward the Balkans, Persia, and Afghanistan. In other words, the Kremlin continues the policy of Tsarist imperialism. We do not have the right in this case to label the policy of the Kremlin itself. Do we not have the right in this case to label the policy of the Kremlin itself imperialist? This historical geographical argument is no more convincing than any of the others. The Proletarian Revolution, which occurred on the territory of the Tsarist Empire, attempted from the very beginning to conquer and for a time conquered the Baltic countries, attempted to penetrate Romania and Persia, and at one time led its armies up to Warsaw in 1920. The lines of revolutionary expansion were the same as those of Tsarism, since revolution does not change geographical conditions. This is precisely why the Mensheviks at that time already spoke of Bolshevik imperialism as barred from the traditions of Tsarist diplomacy. The petty bourgeois democracy willingly resorts to this argument even now. We have no reason, I repeat, for imitating them in this. Agency of imperialism? Question mark. However, aside from the manner in which to appraise the expansionist policy of the USSR itself, there remains the question of the help which Moscow provides the imperialist policy of Berlin. Here, first of all, it is necessary to establish that under certain conditions, up to a certain degree, and in a certain form, the support of this or that imperialism would be inevitable even for a completely healthy workers' state, in virtue of the impossibility of breaking away from the chains of world imperialist relations. The Brest-Litovsk peace, without the least doubt, temporarily reinforced German imperialism against France and England. An isolated worker state cannot fail to maneuver between the hostile imperialist camps. Maneuvering means temporarily supporting one of them against the other. To know exactly which one of the two camps it is more advantageous or less dangerous to support at a certain moment is not a question of principle, but of practical calculation and foresight. The inevitable disadvantage which is engendered as a consequence of this constrained support for one bourgeois state against another is more than covered by the fact that the isolated worker state is thus given the possibility of continuing its existence. But there is maneuvering and maneuvering. At Brest-Litovsk, the Soviet government sacrificed the national independence of the Ukraine in order to salvage the workers' state. Nobody could speak of treason toward the Ukraine, since all the class-conscious workers understood the forced character of this sacrifice. It is completely different with Poland. The Kremlin has never and at no place represented the question as if it had been constrained to sacrifice Poland. On the contrary, it boasts cynically of its combination, which affronts rightfully the most elementary democratic feelings of the oppressed classes and peoples throughout the world, and thus weakens extremely the international situation of the Soviet Union. The economic transformations in the occupied provinces do not compensate for this by even a tenth part. The entire foreign policy of the Kremlin in general is based upon a scoundrelly embellishment of the, quote, friendly imperialism, and thus leads to the sacrifice of the fundamental interests of the world workers' movement for secondary and unstable advantages. After 5 years of duping the workers with slogans for the, quote, defense of the democracies, end quote, Moscow is now occupied with covering up Hitler's policy of pillage. This in itself still does not change the USSR into an imperialist state, but Stalin and his Comintern are now indubitably the most valuable agents of imperialism. If we want to define the foreign policy of the Kremlin exactly, we must say that it is the policy of the Bonapartist bureaucracy of a degenerated workers' state in imperialist encirclement. This definition is not as short or as sonorous as, quote, imperialist policy, but in return it is more precise. Quote, the lesser evil. The occupation of eastern Poland by the Red Army is to be sure a, quote, lesser evil in comparison with the occupation of the same territory by Nazi troops. But this lesser evil was obtained because Hitler was assured of achieving a greater evil. If somebody sets or helps to set a house on fire and afterwards saves 5 out of 10 of the occupants of the house in order to convert those occupants into his own semi-slaves, that is to be sure a lesser evil than to have burned the entire 10. But it is dubious that this firebug merits a medal for the rescue. If nevertheless a medal were given to him, he should be shot immediately after, as in the case of the hero in one of Victor Hugo's novels. Quote, armed missionaries. Robespierre once said that people do not like missionaries with bayonets. By this he wished to say that it is impossible to impose revolutionary ideas and institutions on other people through military violence. This correct thought does not signify, of course, the inadmissibility of military intervention in other countries in order to cooperate in a revolution, but such an intervention as part of the revolutionary international policy must be understood by the international proletariat, must correspond to the desires of the toiling masses of the country on whose territory the revolutionary troops enter. The theory of socialism in one country is not capable naturally of creating this active international solidarity which alone can prepare and justify armed intervention. The Kremlin poses and resolves the question of military invention, like all other questions of the Kremlin's policy, absolutely independently of the ideas and feelings of the international working class. Because of this, the latest diplomatic, quote, successes of the Kremlin monstrously compromise the USSR and introduce extreme confusion into the ranks of the world proletariat. Insurrection on two fronts. But if the question thus shapes itself, comrades say, is it proper to speak of the defense of the USSR and the occupied provinces? Is it not more correct to call upon the workers and peasants in both parts of former Poland to arise against Hitler as well as against Stalin? Naturally, this is very attractive. If revolution surges up simultaneously in Germany and the USSR, including the newly occupied provinces, this would resolve many questions at one blow. But our policy cannot be based upon only the most favorable, the most happy combination of circumstances. The question is posed thus: what to do if Hitler, before he is crushed by revolution, attacks the Ukraine before revolution has smashed Stalin? Will the partisans of the Fourth International in this case fight against the troops of Hitler as they fought in Spain in the ranks of the Republican troops against Franco? We are completely and wholeheartedly for an independent of Hitler as well as Stalin's Soviet Ukraine. But what to do if, before having obtained this independence, Hitler attempts to seize the Ukraine, which is under the domination of the Stalinist bureaucracy? The Fourth International answers, against Hitler, we will defend the Ukraine enslaved by Stalin. Quote, unconditional defense of the USSR, end quote. What does, quote, unconditional, end quote, defense of the USSR mean? Unconditional defense of the USSR means that we do not lay any conditions upon the bureaucracy. Unconditional defense of the USSR means that independently of the motive and causes of the war, we defend the social basis of the USSR if it is menaced by danger on the part of imperialism. Some comrades say, and if, quote, and if the Red Army tomorrow invades India and begins to put down a revolutionary movement in India, shall we in this case support the Red Army? End quote. Such a way of posing a question is not at all consistent. It is not clear above all why India is implicated. Is it not simpler to ask, if the Red Army menaces workers' strikes or peasants' protests against the bureaucracy in the USSR, shall we support it or not? Foreign policy is the continuation of the internal. We have never promised to support all the actions of the Red Army, which is an instrument in the hands of the Bonapartist bureaucracy. We have promised to defend only the USSR as a workers' state and solely those things within the USSR which belong to a workers' state. An adroit casuist can say, if the Red Army, independently of the character of the, quote, work fulfilled by the Red Army, is beaten by the insurgent masses in India, this will weaken the USSR. To this we will answer, the crushing of a revolutionary movement in India, with the cooperation of the Red Army, would signify an incomparably greater danger to the social basis of the USSR than an episodical defeat of the counter-revolutionary detachments of the Red Army in India. In every case, the Fourth International will know how to distinguish where and when the Red Army is acting solely as an instrument of the Bonapartist reaction, and where the Red Army defends the social basis of the USSR. A trade union led by reactionary fakers organizes a strike against the admission of Negro workers into a certain branch of industry. Shall we support such a shameless strike? Of course not, but let us imagine that the bosses utilizing the given strike make an attempt to crush the trade union and to make impossible in general the organized self-defense of the workers. In this case, we will defend the trade union as a matter of course in spite of its reactionary leadership. Why is not this same policy applicable to the USSR? The fundamental rule. The Fourth International has established firmly that in all imperialist countries, independent of the fact as to whether those imperialist countries are in alliance with the USSR or in a camp hostile to the USSR, the proletarian parties during the war must develop the class struggle with the purpose of seizing power. At the same time, the proletariat of the imperialist countries must not lose sight of the interests of the USSR's defense, or of that of colonial revolutions, and in case of the real necessity must resort to the most decisive action, for instance, strikes, acts of sabotage, etc. The groupings of the powers since the time the Fourth International formulated this rule have changed radically, but the rule itself retains all its validity. If England and France tomorrow menace Leningrad or Moscow, the British and French workers should take the most decisive measures in order to hinder the sending of soldiers and military supplies. If Hitler finds himself constrained by the logic of the situation to send Stalin military supplies, the German workers, on the contrary, would have no reason for resorting to this concrete case, to strikes or sabotage. Nobody, I hope, will propose any other solution. Quote, revisionism of Marxism, end quote, question mark. Some comrades evidently were surprised that I spoke in my article, quote, the USSR in war, of the system of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism as a theoretical possibility. They discovered in this even a complete revision of Marxism. This is an apparent misunderstanding. The Marxist comprehension of historical necessity has nothing in common with fatalism. Socialism is not realizable, quote, by itself, but as a result of the struggle of living forces, classes, and those classes' parties. The proletariat's decisive advantage in this struggle resides in the fact that it represents historical progress, while the bourgeoisie reincarnates reaction and decline. Precisely in this is the source of our conviction in victory. But we have full right to ask ourselves, what character will society make if the forces of reaction conquer? Marxists have formulated an incalculable number of times the alternative, either socialism or return to barbarism. The Italian, quote, experience we've repeated thousands of times, either communism or fascism. The real passage to socialism cannot fail to appear incomparably more complicated, more heterogeneous, more contradictory than was foreseen in the general historical scheme. Marx spoke about the dictatorship of the proletariat and the dictatorship of the proletariat's future withering away, but said nothing about bureaucratic degeneration of the dictatorship. We have observed and analyzed for the first time and experienced such a degeneration. Is this revision of Marxism? The march of events has succeeded in demonstrating that the delay of the socialist revolution engenders the indubitable phenomenon of barbarism, chronic unemployment, pauperization of the petty bourgeoisie, fascism, finally wars of extermination which do not open up any new road. What social and political forms can the new, quote, barbarism take? If we admit theoretically that mankind should not be able to elevate itself to socialism, we have the possibility of expressing ourselves on this subject more concretely than Marx. Fascism on the one hand, degeneration of the Soviet state on the other, outline the social and political forms of neo-barbarism. An alternative of this kind, socialism or totalitarian servitude, is not only theoretical interest, but also enormous importance in agitation, because in its light the necessity for socialist revolution appears most graphically. If we are to speak of a revision of Marx, it is in reality the revision of those comrades who project a new type of state, quote, non-bourgeois and, quote, non-worker. Because the alternative developed by me leads them to draw their own thoughts up to their logical conclusions, some of these critics, frightened by the conclusions of their own theory, accuse me of revising Marxism. I prefer to think that it is simply a friendly jest. The right of revolutionary optimism. I endeavored to demonstrate in my article, The USSR and the War, that the perspective of a non-worker and non-bourgeois society of exploitation, or, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, is the perspective of complete defeat and the decline of the international proletariat, the perspective of the most profound historical pessimism. Are there any genuine reasons for such a perspective? Is it not superfluous to inquire about this among our class enemies? In the weekly of the well-known newspaper Paris Soir of August 31st, 1939, an extremely instructive conversation is reported between the French ambassador Coulond and Hitler on the 25th of August at the time of their last interview. The source of the information is undoubtedly Coulond himself. Hitler sputters boast of the pact which he concluded with Stalin, quote, a realistic pact, end quote, and, quote, regrets, end quote, that German and French blood will be spilled. But, Coulond objects, quote, Stalin displayed great double-dealing. The real victor in case of war will be Trotsky. Have you ever thought this over, end quote. Quote, I know, Der Führer responds, quote, but why did France and Britain give Poland complete freedom of action, end quote, etc. These gentlemen like to give a personal name to the specter of revolution. But this, of course, is not the essence of this dramatic conversation at the very moment when diplomatic relations were ruptured. Quote, war will inevitably provoke revolution, end quote. The representative of imperialist democracy, himself chilled to the marrow, frightens his adversary. Quote, I know, Hitler responds, as if it were a question decided long ago. Quote, I know. Astonishing dialogue. Both of them, Coulond and Hitler, represent the barbarism which advances over Europe. At the same time, neither of them doubts that their barbarism will be conquered by socialist revolution. Such is now the awareness of the ruling class of all the capitalist countries of the world. Their complete demoralization is one of the most important elements in the relation of class forces. The proletariat has a young and still weak revolutionary leadership. But the leadership of the bourgeoisie rots on its feet. At the very outset of the war, which they could not avert, these gentlemen are convinced in advance of the collapse of their regime. This fact alone must be for us the source of invincible revolutionary optimism. October 18th, 1939. Thanks for listening.